full. Are you going to have to forget how to do long division in order to make room for Grails or anything like that? No, I hope not. We officially start in 5 minutes, is that right? At 1700, if I'm not mistaken? Yeah, so we'll just wait for a few more minutes to let people gather in. There's no rain this afternoon like there was yesterday afternoon either. That was a little taste of monsoon season, huh? So my understanding, this is my first time to India, but my understanding is Bangalore is typically fairly mild compared to other cities in India. Yeah, the weather's been very nice. I mean, even with the heavy downpour yesterday, the weather has actually been very nice. So looking forward to this. Venkat's from Chennai originally, and so after we do all of our presentations tomorrow, we're actually hopping on Kingfisher Air and flying over to spend some time over there. We don't allow beer companies to fly airplanes in the United States. That's a new one for me. I like that. What airline did you fly? Coors Airline. Yes. No, not at all. Yeah. I'm sorry? We have all been laughing. Matthew and I sat down in the speaker's lounge and we read the Wikipedia, the entire Wikipedia article on cricket. We still have no idea how that game is played. None whatsoever. There are wickets, and there are overs, yes, and innings. And we learned that you don't have an inning singular. They're all plural, right? We had 1 innings and 2 innings and 3 innings and 4 innings, yeah. Yeah, so we understand that it's much like baseball, except it goes on for 3 or 4 days at a time. Baseball only feels like it's 3 or 4 days long. Cricket is 3 or 4 days long, very long. But Bangalore lost last night, yeah? Oh, that's too bad. I heard it was very close in the beginning, and then later on, yeah, not so much. Oh, that's too bad. It wasn't our fault. We were cheering for Bangalore. Is that what it was? Yeah. And apparently there was some big scandal as well, some tax scandals, I guess, about the... It's a good thing we don't have any scandals in the United States. We are scandal-free there, so... Well, what do you think? Should we get started? Yes, let's do this. It's so wonderful seeing all of you here at the very end of a very long day. What we're going to be talking about here is Grails, which is a web framework. Now, if you were in my earlier talk talking about Groovy, what you'll find is this is a web framework that uses Groovy to tie all the basic pieces together. My company is thirstyhead.com. My partners and I, we focus on Groovy and Grails training and advocacy and writing articles and books and those kinds of things. This book, I think, would be especially appropriate for you to Google. If you look up Getting Started with Grails, you'll find this is absolutely a free download. It's a PDF, 160-page book that you can download for free. So in the 40 or 50 minutes that we have, 50 minutes, is that right? 50, yeah. Yeah, so in the 50 minutes we have together, I'll be able to give you a taste. But if you're looking for more information, you can download Getting Started with Grails. I also write a number of articles at IBM Developer Works, both practically Groovy and mastering Grails. I've been writing these for a number of years, so there's a lot of good information available for you out there. So rather than making you all experts in Grails at the end of this talk, maybe you can begin seeing at least the possibilities of what you can do. But what's especially interesting about Grails is that there are a lot of companies that are using this. Wired.com is using Grails. LinkedIn, Evite, Sky TV has converted all of their websites to Grails. I mean, these are websites that are handling millions and millions of hits. The really nice thing about Grails is that it is Java development at the end of the day. As we'll see here, this is Spring Hibernate kind of development. How many of you are using Spring and Hibernate right now? in your organization? Absolutely. And so what we'll find is that this is not a special Groovy version of Swing. This is just Swing like you're using right now. This is not a special Groovy-enabled version of Hibernate. This is Hibernate that you're using right now. The benefit of using Groovy is that Groovy is a perfect superset of Java. So we can continue to use JUnit and Spring and Hibernate and Xerces and all of these typical Java jars that you would normally do. Groovy is just the glue language that's beginning to hold these things together. Does that make sense? Yeah, outstanding. So if you were to go out to grails.org, they would say the search is over. This is the very last web framework you'll ever need to use. I don't know about that, but it's certainly the one that I've been quite a big fan of because I am a Java developer. I like Hibernate. I like JUnit. I like these kinds of libraries. I don't often like the amount of Java code that I need to write in order to use them, but I like the functionality. These are tried and true technologies. They've been proven in the workspace, kind of a best-of-breed type of solution. And so when I was doing Grails work, the very first application I wrote was using Grails 0.3. This was back in late 2005. And people were looking at me saying, are you insane? Using an 0.3 web framework? And I said, well, in fact, it's Spring 2.0. It's Hibernate 3.0, it's Tomcat 5. Whatever was, most recent at the time. I'm using MySQL, I'm using Ant, I'm using all of these libraries. The only thing that was O dot about that was Groovy, and the O in Groovy was 1.0. So in fact, even though Grails, the framework, was 0.3, all of the technology was production quality technology. Grails is far past the O dot stage right now. The most recent version, I believe, is 1.2.2 that came out, and 1.3 is in early beta right now. So they are on a very active, aggressive development and deployment cycle. You might notice a little logo up here in the corner here, Spring Source. I had someone talk to me over the break saying, the first thing my manager is going to ask me is, where do we go for support? And Spring Source officially offers service and support. So if you need any kind of training, any kind of professional services, 24-hour support, anything like that, this is mainstream production-ready software. Yeah? Yes? This is a very good question. Where did Groovy and Grails come from originally? They are both open source projects that started originally outside of Spring Source. Groovy was a language that was started by a gentleman named James Strachan. Guillaume Laforge is the current technical lead on that. He's based out of Paris. Graham Roche is the technical lead of Grails. He was based out of the UK. I believe he's living in Spain now. When these two language and framework appropriately were being developed in the open source community, they decided to band together and form a company to offer professional services and support. And that company was named G21, kind of a clever Graham and Guillaume, G21, and Groovy and Grails, G21, so it worked on very many levels. There was a third founder, Alex Tkachman, who was the former CEO of JetBrains, the maker of IntelliJ. So that company was formed, and they were around for about a year and a half, who were then acquired by Spring Source, which, as you know, Spring Source was most recently acquired by VMware. And so there's a lot of good professional support. But there continue to be open source Apache licensed technology that accept contributions from the community at large. Yeah, very good question. So Grails, I've been saying over and over again, is a Spring Hibernate application, much like we would expect to see. I mean, Spring and Hibernate and Apache XML, Xerces, Jetty, Log4j, Ant, JUnit, all of these technologies. You'll notice that these are not, once again, Groovy-specific technologies. These are the Java libraries themselves. As a matter of fact, if we were to go in and look at the webinf lib directory, again, this is JEE, development. This is a standard WAR file that has web.xml and web.inflib and web.ins classes and all those things. If we were to look in web.inflib, we would see all of these jars that we would expect to see. Oh, good, there's site mesh, there's Spring, there's log4j, there's JSTL libraries, JUnit like that. As a matter of fact, the only Groovy specific things we'll see in here are these two right here. I said in my previous presentation, the way you Groovy enable any Java project is drop that single Groovy jar into the class path. And in fact, for the build script, Grails doesn't use ant, it uses Gant, which is a Groovy implementation of ant. But once again, it's not rewriting any of those libraries. What it's doing is rather than forcing you to use XML to define the build script, it uses Groovy syntax. So Gant is in fact ant with the thin Groovy facade over it. When you hear people talking about GORM, the Grails object relational mapper, GORM is in fact a thin Groovy facade over Hibernate. We can write test cases, JUnit test cases, or we could write Groovy test cases, which are thin Groovy facades over test cases. So you see this pattern building over and over and over again. These are the core libraries we're used to dealing with, and we can write them in Java, but no one does. No one does. We're going to use the Groovy syntax, that dramatically simpler syntax, to pull all these Java libraries together. Does that make sense? Yes. Now, I've been following Grails, as I said, since the O.dot days, O.2, O.3, and what I love about Grails is Grails core continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And isn't that a breath of fresh air? Typically, libraries get larger and larger and more complex, grow hair and tentacles and warts and everything else. And what Grails is actually doing is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and spinning out additional functionality in plugins. There are now well over 200 different plugins that you can use. So Quartz is a technology you might use. It basically allows you to do cron jobs in a JEE environment. Quartz was originally bundled with Grails core. They spun that off into a plugin. So as we begin seeing more and more of these libraries, we're not losing functionality. We're in fact gaining functionality, but we're getting a very tight, focused core with rich plugins that allow us to do these kinds of things. People have been asking, oh, can I use GWT and Grails? Well, yeah, there's a GWT Grails plugin. Can I use Wicket in Grails? Yeah, there's a Wicket Grails plugin. Can I use JSF? Can I use Flex? Can I use any of these alternate view technologies? Yes, there are plugins for each one of those that would allow you to use Grails on the front end and whatever view technology you'd like on the front end. And it's, of course, not limited to view technologies. There are testing plugins. There are persistence plugins. If you're into all of this NoSQL stuff, MongoDB and CouchDB and Cassandra and all of these, there are plugins for all of those kinds of things as well. So we see, again, very tight core, but almost infinitely expandable based on the very rich plugin ecosystem. So to get started, this is your one-slide guide to installing Grails right here. What you would do is you go out to grails.org, you download grails.zip or grails.tar, it's Java, of course, right? Won't run anywhere. You'll create a Grails home environment variable. You'll add Grails home bin to your path, and you're set. What else does this sound like? Tomcat, JBoss, Ant, Java itself. Yeah, exactly. And so this is a very simple installation process. And what we end up doing there is end up calling Grails from the command line. And Grails provides a number of scripts. Now, I told you already that Grails is using Gant under the covers as its build system. How many of you in here use Maven? Yeah, there is support. I don't use Maven myself, but there is support in Grails if you wanted to bring Grails into a Maven-type environment. You'll see that what Gant provides you is a very Maven-like environment, Maven-like, but not Maven itself. But there is good, solid Maven support in here as well. What's interesting is that Grails at some point, probably in the 1.3 version, it will move to a new build system called Gradle. And Gradle is a Maven-like, there's also Gmaven, but Gradle is a Maven-like build system, but it's implemented in Groovy. But for right now, it's implemented in Gantt. And so we can go through these basic steps and build ourselves a typical Groovy application. So I can come in here right now and say, Grails, if you would please, I'd like to create a bookstore. And Grails will scaffold out this bookstore, much like in Maven. You'll see I'll have a standard set of directories that come out here. Oh, it says, would I like to upgrade? Sure. Yeah, would I like to upgrade as well? You can see this is a typical application, so I'm also going to type in Grails clean to get rid of whatever that cruft was that I was being nagged about. There we go. Oops, let me change into the bookstore directory. There we go, and type in a Grails clean. And there we go. And now I'll be sure that I'm in a nice clean installation. I apologize. There we go. So in this scaffolded directory that we have here, we'll see that there is a place for us to drop our jars, the lib directory. There's a place for us to drop our source file. Since this is Java at the end of the day, if you have legacy Java classes that you want to bring over, if you have Java classes that have EJB3 annotations in them, you can drop them into source Java and they'll be compiled and included. If you have HBM files, there's a Hibernate directory where you can drop them in and include them. But that's more for legacy support. Typically, all the interesting stuff will happen in this Grails app directory. So if we go in and take a look at this Grails app directory, you'll find that there is a directory set up for our domain classes, our controllers, our views, taglibs, services, and so on and so forth. There's a place for our integration tests and our unit tests. There's a place for our JavaScript and CSS and images and the typical web type directories that you would expect to see. Now again, I'm using TextMate, which is a text editor right here. Typically, if you're in a Java shop, you'll reach out and you'll use Eclipse, or you'll use IntelliJ, or you'll have NetBeans. All of them have very, very strong support. I absolutely use TextMate in production when I'm doing primarily Groovy and Grails support. There's no need for a heavy IDE when we see the brevity of the syntax here, but if I'm using a mixed Java and Groovy type of project, I'll typically use IntelliJ. It's the IDE I've been using for years, and so that's the one I'd reach out for. But we see there's not a whole lot going on. I don't have any domain classes yet. I don't have any controllers. I don't have any views to speak of. You'll notice there are a couple of GSP pages. Groovy server pages, yeah, in there. But what I would want to do after I've created this application is I'd want to come in here and say, Grails, I would like to create a domain class named book. And as a matter of fact, I could even package it up if I wanted to. I'd like to have a thirsty head book in my application. And so it'll reach out. It will build my Pogo, plain old Groovy object, and it'll also create a corresponding set of tests for that book class as well. So we saw this in the previous presentation, that now in my domain class, when I have a book in here, we can see that it is truly a public class, although we don't have to specify that. All classes in Groovy are public by default. I could come in here and say private string name, something like that. But since attributes are private by default, I could say string title, string author, integer pages, so on and so forth. We saw in the previous presentation, I'm sorry, I won't do that very much often to you, but we saw in the previous presentation that this will also generate getters and setters for us. So we will be able to call those kinds of things there. But what's really especially interesting about this is we'll see that Grails will dynamically add new methods like save and delete and list and things like that. So there's a whole bunch going on here that we don't have to write. We just specify the basic attributes and call it good. So there's one more thing I want to do here, and then we'll be ready to run our first application. I want to say, Grails, if you would please, I'd like to create a controller for thirsty head book as well. If I were doing this in an IDE, there would be menus. I would right-click and I would generate it from in there. All of the IDEs literally are just a GUI front end to these command line backends. So I spend as much of my time in the command line as I possibly can, and so this is my work pattern right here. But I can now have created a controller for that book and the corresponding tests. If I come back in and take a look at my source tree, I'll see that controller, thirsty head, book controller like this. I'm going to make one more change. Def scaffold equals true. That's a bit of Grails specific syntax, but in that one line, def scaffold equals true, what I'm saying is, Grails, if you would please, I would like a full CRUD application. I'd like full create, retrieve, update, and delete. I'd like HTML tables and forms, all of that in a single line of code. So let's count how many lines of code I've written right here so far. I said def scaffold equals true. I said, well, I'd like a title, author, pages. I'm tired. Let's go ahead and just run this. That's enough typing, don't you think? Yeah. So what I will do right now is I'll come out here. I will type in Grails run app. And what we'll find is Grails ships with its own database, its own embedded database, HSQLDB. How many of you are JBoss developers? Yeah? JBoss ships with HSQLDB as well, doesn't it? Do you use it in production? Of course not. We won't use it in production either, but it's a way for us to bootstrap here. Since this is Hibernate, Grails has support for all the databases you'd use. Oracle, Microsoft SQL, MySQL, Postgres, any of those kinds of things. But for up and running purposes, we'll just use HSQLDB. Grails ships with its own embedded web server. It used to ship standard with Jetty. Any of you use Jetty in production? JBoss used to use Jetty. JBoss converted to Tomcat in there, and in Grails 1.2, Grails converted to Tomcat as well. But these are both supported as plugins right now. So I can type in Grails install plugin Jetty, and it would use Jetty as the embedded servlet container. Or I've got the Tomcat plugin, or I can type in Grails War, and I get the full War that I can drop into WebSphere or WebLogic, Geronimo, JBoss, whatever you'd like. But in that amount of time, what Grails did was it created the database for me behind the scenes, did all the meta programming it needed. It spun up my servlet container and said, hey, if you go visit localhost 9090 bookstore, we can come in here right now, and we'll see there's our application. This is the default look and feel, but if we come in and drill down into here, we'll see that I can come in here and I can create a number of new books. I can come in and say, all right, we'd like to say Getting Started with Grails is a 160-page book by Scott Davis. Got another book, Programming Scala. That's a 300-page book by Venkat. I'm sorry, we don't have enough time to type in his full last name. Venkat will have to suffice. That joke gets big laughs in America. You're saying Subramanian, that's not that long. Come on, you have time for that. Yeah, Venkat's a good friend of mine, obviously. But we come in here right now. Venkat has another book out called Programming Groovy. He has no loyalty to languages whatsoever. It's a 301-page book. Here's Venkat as well. And so we can see now we've got a number of different titles in here. We can come in and sort them by any of these given fields. If I wanted to come in and edit this, technically this book is a 302-page book, right? We can come in and save this back out again. How did this get generated in the first place? So that one line, that def scaffold equals true, is my instruction to Grails. If you would, please, I'd like you to create this typical boilerplate application. Now, you're not limited to this kind of look and feel. If we were to go out to wired.com, and we'll see I've been fairly lucky so far with the internet. Let's see if I continue to be lucky. Let's see if I continue to be lucky. Let's see if I continue to be lucky. Well, while we're waiting for this to come up, when this comes up, you'll see this won't have this standard look and feel by any stretch. The Wired Reviews website, this is using Grails under the scenes, but obviously they've been able to skin this using CSS and JavaScript and any kind of look and feel that you want. But this allows us to get started. this gives us a starting point that we can go in and tune and tweak and convert and modify and do these kinds of things. If I were to take you out to the startup that I'm working for right now, closely.com, startup based out of Denver, you'll see this will have an entirely different look and feel to it, but this is using Grails under the cover. If we were to go to one more, I don't know why I'm pressing my luck so much, but if we were going to go to another website, trimet.org, actually ride.trimet.org, this is the Portland, Oregon Transit Authority. You'll see this website comes up, and this will be something that looks like Groovy and Grails, Google Maps. It's in fact Groovy and Grails under the covers, but this has yet another completely different look and feel. And that's part of what I wanted to talk about in the title of this talk, is that even though we see this simple HTML table CRUD-based application, Grails is not limited to that at all. When this comes up, see, I should have stopped while I was ahead, shouldn't I? When this comes up, you'll see this looks nothing like that typical scaffolded out Grails application. This will have a nice big map right there that I can drag and drop and move around. Oh, see, that's what all I had to do. I had to flick my fingers at the list. Hocus pocus. There we go. And so as this thing comes up, we'll see this is Groovy and Grails under the covers, much like this is Groovy and Grails under the covers, much like this is Groovy and Grails under the covers as well. Closely, we're focused on Twitter and Facebook and those kinds of integrations. TriMet is certainly focused on mapping bus routes and light rails and trains and trolleys and things like that. Wired are these kinds of reviews. We're not limited to this kind of HTML table form CRUD kind of thing, but it's nice to get these things started. And as a matter of fact, if I were to take you into the administrative screens of closely.com, they would all look like this. Since we're the administrators, we don't care what the look and feel looks like. We're going to use this default scaffolded out view. But for our public-facing stuff, we're going to continue to make them pretty and nice looking. Yeah? So, all of that is kind of right here. I call this your one-slide guide to Grails because, in fact, we typed in Grails create app bookstore. We changed to that bookstore directory. We created a domain class. We generated the rest of this information, and we said run app. Now, there's lots more that we can do, but think about what we've just managed here. If I were giving you a Struts presentation, and I were 20 minutes into my presentation, how far would I be at this point? Yeah? How do you start a new Struts application? Is there a Struts create app? No. You copy an existing Struts application over, start throwing out jars. I don't think we need that one. Oh, I don't know. I better leave that one alone. Yeah? Yeah. So what we have here is I could go out and create additional applications very, very easily. It makes it very easy to get started and bootstrap this. I said this yesterday. I don't think Grails moves the goalposts. I think the goalposts are the same. What Grails does is moves the starting line. So it takes care of all of that really mundane boilerplate stuff that I don't care about. I don't need to write another HTML table again in my life. I don't need to write another HTML form that marshals name value pairs into a POJO, saves that database. All of that is really well understood, and that's what Grails really excels at. What I'm able to do is, given the starting line, start doing the interesting things like applying it to a Google map or posting it to Twitter or Facebook or any of those kinds of things. Performance. This is an excellent question right here. So, Groovy, because it's a dynamic language, will be slower than Java. I'm talking milliseconds. But if we think about this in terms of web application, this is where I spend a lot of my time doing Grails web development. When we actually turn around and we perf test our applications, we find that the two long poles in our tent, the two places where our real pain points are in terms of performance, is putting HTTP packets on the wire, that hop from my web server down to the client. So we aggressively cache at that end. We do far future expires headers and do everything we can to get this caching going on from the web server to the client. We find the other long pole in the tent is between our application and the database. So with Hibernate, we set up second-level caching. We aggressively cache as much as we can there. We use memcached and memcached-db and all of those kinds of things. The middle tier, the delta between Java and Groovy, is inconsequential. It's a rounding error compared to those two very long poles in the tent. Yeah, very good question. What about a clustered environment? So we would cluster this as you would cluster anything else. If you're in a JBoss environment, you'd use JBoss clustering. If you were in Tomcat, you'd use Tomcat clustering. You could use Terracotta. You could use those kinds of things. The really wonderful thing is this is a WAR file. I can go out right now and type in Grails WAR, and I'll get a standard WAR file. And at that point, it is app server specific. Yeah, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I had a question. You mentioned the JSF plugin. So
Yes. Yeah, you would use it. Now I mentioned, I'm glad that you asked this, because JSF and GWT and Flex, they all tend to be component-oriented web frameworks. This tends to be much more of a page-centric framework. And so there will be a little bit of mismatch in terms of, well, I'm thinking in terms of components. It's completely doable. There's no question about it. We can support that. But I just wanted to mention that this is going to be more of a typical Struts or Rails or Grails or kind of page-centric type of mentality. But I know people, Evite is using GWT on the front end and Grails on the back end. I can't think of a good public example. I know there are lots of people privately who are using JSF and Grails. I can't think of a public company that might be doing that, but absolutely those kinds of things are available. So what you would do is you would type in Grails install plugin JSF and manage it from there. Yeah, yes?
Can you also change the scaffolding itself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what we can do here is we can come in and we can type in Grails install templates. And so what this is going to do is this is going to give me full access to the templates. So coming in here right now, if I look in my source directory, normally I would just see Groovy in Java, but by typing in Grails install templates, I now see the templates. And so this is where I could come in here and based on the scaffolding, I could say, all right, in my list view, here's what I would like to see. And I will go right before our typical H1 right here and say, this is something I did. Yeah? So now, I'm still scaffolding those things out, but when I turn around and run this again, and that's a really trivial example, but obviously that is where you'd be able to go in and do your deep, deep customization on your look and feel. What we'll be able to do, there's that one file that gets copied over. That's that new change that I just made right there. When I come in here and the Grails app is running right now, if I come in here and do a refresh, we'll see that this is something I did at GIDS right now. Yeah? So that's the basic way that you would work down that list. So let's see what else we can do here. Mention this in the context of your question, that we are a typical MVC kind of framework. But what's especially interesting about this is we use convention over configuration. In Struts, you use configuration over configuration. The XML never ends, does it? You're writing more and more XML. It's the joy of XML. Here, what we do is we based it on simple name matching. So I had a book class, and that corresponds to a book controller. And in my views directory, I have a book directory in there that corresponds to these kinds of things. And so we can see just by doing those simple named matching, I don't have to write a lick of XML. Everything just kind of snaps together nicely. Now, I can always override those kinds of things if I want to, but this is the convention. Yeah? Yes. What dependency injection do you think it uses? Who maintains the project? Spring, absolutely, yeah. So it uses Spring. Currently, I'm using Grails 1.2.1, and that's using Spring 2. Whatever the latest was. When Grails 1.3 comes out, it's going to be using Spring 3.0 under the covers as well. Yeah, very good question. Very good question. I'm sorry, ask me a little bit. I was catching noise from outside. Yeah?
Can we use EOP or aspect J along with?
Absolutely, yeah. You can use aspect J in this kind of thing as well. Yep. Yep. So let's come in here and do a little bit more on this now. So coming over here, I see the book is listed in this order: title, author, pages. When I come in here and create a new book, title, pages, author. Title, author, pages. Title, pages, author. We have this block right in here, the static constraints block, that really allows me to put things in any particular order that I would like. Now bear in mind that I just made these changes right here. The web server is up and running, and all I have to do is come in. Oh, I didn't wait long enough. All I have to do is come in here and be a little more patient. There we go. And now it's in the particular order that I specified it in. So this static constraints block allows me to say, no, what I would really like is I'd really like to see it in title, and then in author, and then in pages. But if this was just for alphabetization, that wouldn't be nearly as interesting. Given the name of the block, constraints, you'll find that what we can do is something like this. We can say blank false, nullable false. Yeah, this kind of stuff, right? So pages, I can come in, I can say minimum is 0. We can't have any -1 paged books. Yeah? And so we can begin building out some constraints in this kind of stuff as well. So if we're able to come in here right now, let me do a quick refresh. All right, not that quick. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. Oh, goodness. Usually this is instantaneous. I must have some background process going or something that's eating my availability. Did I bail out? No, it's still running. Bookstore, are you there? Are you making a liar out of me? Oh, goodness. So the exciting thing is typically I don't have to reboot. I'm going to go ahead and just run this right now, try to clean things up a little bit. It's the end of the day. We're all tired, right? Even Grails is a little bit tired. So when Grails comes back up now, there we go. All right, we'll come back into this book controller, and I'll be able to create a new book. And if I go to just create nothing at all in there, Grails is going to yell at me. Property title of class cannot be blank. Property pages cannot be null. Remember we set that constraint in there of less than 0, so if I come in and try to say -1, it says, I'm sorry, -1 is less than that minimum value. What do you think of those error messages? Best error messages ever? Yeah. I had a client once tell me, it feels like I'm being scolded by a robot. Minimum value -1 is less than minimum. So, as a Java developer, how would you expect to change those? Where would you expect these messages to be stored? Absolutely, yes. And this is the wonderful thing about Grails. As Java developers, we're going to be using those kinds of things. We have an I18N directory. And we'll see we have properties in Deutsch, in Espanol, in Francais, in Italian. I have never looked for Indian. There is no native, well, I understand. That was an ugly American moment. I apologize. It's not an Indian language, but yeah, I mean, there's no Hindi or there's no anything like that. But this is absolutely how you would manage those kinds of things. But if we go and look at the at least message.properties, we'll begin seeing these kinds of things. Here is our default invalid min message. Property of class with value is less than right? So we could come in here right now and we could change that default error message to be something a little more friendly. I prefer starting all of my error messages with dude. It's there. Dude, not enough pages. Yeah? And so we could come in here right now, try to submit that again, and I see, dude, not enough pages, right? And so, we could turn around and we could begin customizing this. That was the default error message, but we can also go in and customize that on a per class, per field basis as well. So if the pages were too small, we'd specify it as book.pages. We'll see that we're using the HSQLDB JDBC driver. Here's our username and password, and here is our JDBC connection screen. What's especially nice is that Grails supports a number of environments as well, so you can see that in development mode, I can use one set of credentials. In test mode, I could use something different. In production, I could use something very different as well. And these are infinitely extensible as well. So, we can come in here right now and decide that we wanted to have a QA environment. And in QA environment, we would use these different kinds of files.
Why does it generate the code to Grails?
When I type in Grails run app, that's when it generates that code. Or if I were to type in Grails war, that's when it would generate the.
Why does it generate it? That was the question.
Oh, where does it generate it?
Can we take a look?
Right up here in memory. It's all dynamically at runtime. Now, one of the things we can do, let me do this. Let's say that our bookstore also sells magazines. And so one of the things I could do is I could say Grails create domain class, a com, thirsty head, magazine. And this next time what I'll do is I'll add a couple of fields to this magazine real quickly. And then rather than saying def scaffold equals true and have all that magic going on behind the scenes, I will actually generate the code so we can actually see what's going on behind the scenes. So I'll come in here just real quickly and say a magazine has a title and it comes out in a given month. So that's enough just to give us an idea of what's going on there. And then this time, instead of saying Grails create controller, create domain class, create filter unit test, any of these things, these create empty stubbed out shells of these classes, I'll come in and I'll say Grails generate. And I could generate just the controller or just the views, or in my case, I'm going to say Grails generate all for a com, thirsty head magazine.
See, nowhere in our code we said that book is a persistent entity. How does it,
This is a very good question. Nowhere did I say that this book was persistable. Let me go in and show you this magazine code real quick, and then we'll talk about how that's going there. But in fact, the way it's able to do this is through metaprogramming. It will dynamically add those new methods on at runtime. So if I come in here real quickly, we'll see that my magazine controller looks much different than my book controller does. My book controller says def scaffold equals true. It says just give me this kind of default behavior. My magazine controller, we can see, is a little more fleshed out. I've got the list closure and the create closure and save and show and edit and update and delete and all these kinds of things. And so this is where I could go in and override this default behavior. But this gets back to your question. This is why I wanted to show you this here. When we're in here, we see magazine instance dot delete. We see magazine get. We see magazine has errors, magazine save. All of these methods that clearly don't exist on magazine anywhere. And so how does this happen? Well, Groovy is a dynamic language. It means that dynamically at runtime, Grails is adding save methods and delete methods and list and get and has errors and all those kinds of things. So a brief digression real quickly just to show you how this works. This won't be inside of the Grails app at all. But let me do a meta test just to show you conceptually what's going on. when I come in here and I say message, Groovy is cool, that's going to come out as we would expect it to come out. Now let's suppose for a moment that I wanted to shout that message. What would you expect to see at this point? Well, you'd see a compiler error, right? Now in Groovy it says, well, hey, wait a second. No signature of method, Java lang string, shout is available. One man's syntax error is another man's language feature. Now, in Groovy, what I'm able to do is I'm able to say string.metaclass.shout equals delegate to uppercase. Now I'm going to run this and then we'll go back and explore what that syntax actually means. But we can see that I am now indeed shouting that message, right? Now, string is a final class in Java. This is a Java lang string. So in fact, what Groovy is doing, the way all classes work, and this gets back to the performance question that you asked earlier, that in a statically compiled language, at compile time, the compiler figures out if you're calling methods that exist on a class. And so it is optimized for speed. In Groovy, the way this works is a two-pass call. We'll see that every class, every Java class, every Groovy class, in fact, has an expando metaclass. And you need to say it in a very special way. You can't just say expando metaclass. That's not dramatic enough. You need to say expando metaclass. You know, it's required. Expando metaclass, because that is how the dynamic programming works out of this. We can see that, in fact, I added the shout method, not to string itself, but to the metaclass of string. And so down here, when I call message.shout, it hits the metaclass first. Is there a shout method? Why, yes, there is. It returns. If there's not a shout method on the metaclass, it'll go and look for it on the delegate. Yeah? These two keywords, metaclass and delegate, they don't exist in Java because we don't have any way to express this concept in Java. But the delegate, in fact, is the string that we get in there. We're calling the two uppercase method on the string to return that kind of stuff. So, to give you one more example here, if I were to say string.metaclass .2 uppercase, oh no. He's not really going to, oh no, really? What do you think we're going to get when we run this now? We're whispering it now, right? It's in two lowercase. But in fact, this proves what we were saying in here, that when I am calling string to uppercase, in fact, it's hitting the metaclass, and I have remapped that to be anything that I want it to be. Now, this is an anti-pattern, right? I wouldn't do this in production at all. But you can begin seeing the power of metaprogramming. I said in the previous presentation that Groovy is wonderful for unit testing. Imagine you have some Java class where you call a method and it does some really expensive SOAP call out there. And in production, you want it to do that. But in testing, you don't want to reach out and do that SOAP call. And suppose you don't have an interface and you don't have a mock and you don't have anything like that. For unit testing purposes, I could go in and remap that to return null or to return a sample message or to return something like that. This metaprogramming right now is on the string level. But I could also turn around and do the metaprogramming on the instance as well. So now I can say println yeah? And what did I do here?
String dot
Message dot to uppercase.
To uppercase. Now, hold on. So I'm expecting string to have a shout method. Let me read this message one more time here. No signature. Interesting.
You should call message dot to uppercase. shout method.
Message.shout.
Yeah, you have not defined message or
On my page.
Message.
You have not been message or tool work yet.
You are not defined shout for string.
Yeah. Let me come in here real quickly and just comment this out. And make sure this much runs. This is not the point of the presentation right here. There we go, something like that. So what if I were to come in here real quickly and I was able to say message.metaclass.shout equals something ridiculous like boot. All right, let's see what happens now. There we go. So I'm not quite sure what I did wrong there, but my point is we can do instance level metaprogramming as well as class level metaprogramming. This is a very, very powerful concept, and even though this is a toy example right here, this exact functionality is what's going on inside of our controller when I'm calling has errors and save and get and delete and all that. And to re-answer your question one more time, this does incur a slight performance penalty, milliseconds, and on a multi-core, multi-gigabyte RAM server class type application, it's a rounding error. You will not notice the difference between Java and Groovy in a web application when we're dealing with database issues and HTTP issues.
If you are generating a war,
Yes.
automatically the meta class also gets generated. The meta.
Absolutely, yeah, that gets all included inside of that WAR file as well. And so if I come in real quickly and show you the WAR file that gets generated, we'll go in and take a look at that WAR file, and it'll be a well-formed WAR file. It'll have all those jars in there that I pointed out, and that single groovy.jar, which is what gives us all the metaprogramming capabilities. You had a question as well. Yes.
Ideally, I shouldn't be doing any meta class on a class. It's good to do it on an instance because if there are two developers who have a meta class defined on a string. Shout, I have defined one implementation. There's another developer who has done another implementation for the same shout method. So at runtime, I'll have which one will be loaded.
So there are a couple of things that we can do in there in terms of metaprogramming. The use case that you just explained right there, you define it on a string and someone else defines it on a string, the last one wins. But there are ways that when you're doing metaprogramming, you can do metaprogramming defensively to say, oh, if this method already exists, don't override it. Throw an exception that we can deal with it that way. There's even yet another way to manage that, which is to do a scoped form of metaprogramming. It's the equivalent of a try-catch block, but it's in a use block, USE block. And you could say, just for the context of this use block, I want to do this metaprogramming. At the end of that block, all those things go away. So this was the 30-second demonstration of metaprogramming, but it's much more robust. And Venkat's book, Programming Groovy, has entire chapters dedicated to the subtle nuances of all those different things. So, absolutely. Yes, sir?
Yeah. All this time you are referring only the war file, war deployment. I mean, how about the enterprise application deployments? Is it possible to Grails?
So the Grails ecosystem right now will just focus on war files. There's nothing stopping you from calling out to EJBs. There's nothing stopping you from using JPA. There's nothing stopping you from doing all those kinds of things. But you would have to turn around and make sure that your stateless session beans were set up, that your JNDI lookups were set up, or all that kind of stuff. Inside of Grails, it's definitely a web tier application. It's not saying you can't take advantage of those things, but there's nothing in the context of Grails you would really do. You would consume them, but you would build your EJBs using the typical tools that we use. Yeah?
Can I do metaprogramming on static methods now?
Yes, absolutely. You can metaprogram static methods on as well. There's a question over here. Yes?
I want to know whether Groovy supports all the features of Java like thread safety and native code support.
Absolutely. Yes, it does. Very good question. Yes?
Can I use GOM outside Grails, say for the swing-based application?
Can you use GORM outside of Grails? I'm trying to multitask here, I apologize. jar, TBF, target, There we go. There's my bookstore war file right there. And as we build this out, we see JS and images and WebInf and TLDs and templates and WebXML and all those typical things that we would see in there. Can you use GORM outside of Grails? If you Google for that, that is the quest that people are trying to achieve. In fact, it's really hard because we've got to have Hibernate, we need to have Spring, and we need to have the meta-programming that's going on, those kinds of things. So different people have said they've been able to do it with lesser and greater degrees, but I'd say the easy path is just to use it inside of Grails and be done with it. Well, technically possible, but you probably have to do a whole lot more wiring than what we get out of this one.
Why did you name it Kingston Grails?
So the idea was that I kind of hedged my bet because the internet connectivity has been kind of weak. I didn't spend as much time focusing on the Google Maps applications and the Twitter applications and things like that. But the point I wanted to make, and I tried to at least address it verbally, is that Grails is not just a simple CRUD framework. That closely.com, we are doing deep integration with Twitter and Facebook and all of these kinds of things as a pure almost web services play. My work with TriMet was a pure Google Maps kind of play, that Grails is applicable for all those different kinds of things. But since my network connectivity was kind of shaky in here, I did focus more on the local host kind of features that I could demonstrate to make sure that I didn't get bogged down waiting for flaky.
Scott, one
Yes.
question. Does this run on the App Engine, Google App Engine? Does it work with the table?
Does this run on the Google App Engine? Absolutely. And so if I still have Grails, I don't. If this doesn't come up in time, it looks like it might. After I got done saying I didn't have good internet connectivity, let's see here. In this Grails plugin directory, I'm going to type in Google App Engine, and we'll see there's actually a plugin. That we would be able to install that would bring that kind of Google App Engine support on this. Cloud Foundry that we're seeing right there. Oh, interesting. App Engine GORM is giving us this thing. There's the Grails App Engine plugin. So there's some other plugins in here. Interesting. Google Wave plugin. Okay. Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of things in there. These are all community-driven things, and so they're all definitely coming up. But yes, there is Google App Engine support. If you hear people talking about Cloud Foundry is a company it's also a spring source company right now, but it's all based on getting Grails apps deployed out to the Amazon cloud, EC2 and SimpleDB and SimpleQ and all those kinds of things. Probably have time for one more question. Yeah.
Is there any way that I can tell Grails that don't validate this particular field of this domain class while you are doing the same method, on particular this domain class, while I have defined the constraint on that domain class?
Yes, there is. As a matter of fact, there are a number of closures you can have. I talk about it in my book, Getting Started with Grails. There are lifecycle methods you can define on the domain class: before update, after update, before insert, after insert, before delete, after delete, those kinds of things. So you could end up starting to do more validation type code in there. Did you enjoy yourself? Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for that wonderful talk. I'm sure the attendees enjoyed a lot.